70% of digital transformations fail. And there's no question that the number one reason for that is lack of leadership engagement. The most important factor in a digital transformation is not technology, but leadership. Leadership sets the vision, creates the climate for innovation, and builds the capabilities to execute. You have to have leaders who model radical candor, like tell me what I'm really seeing, because AI will surface your dysfunction if you're not careful. You want to solve world hunger, pick a street. There's so many world hunger level issues that we're dealing with. Every one of us is a leader because everybody's got access to AI. So our capacity for change is immense, but pick a street and get started.
Hello, everyone. It's Daniel Kube here, and here's another episode of Executive Conversations. And today, we're lucky to have an old friend of mine, Julian Mills, who we started off as, he was a partner of mine when I was at Igloo Software. And Julian was part of, at that time, one of the leading organizations in North America to help organizations uncover, unblock, and build this thing called the intranet of an organization. Then was something that was really a challenge for most organizations. In most organizations, the concept of an intranet was where documents went to die. An intranet properly executed, is something that can add a ton of business value and allowed organizations to self-serve, make things happen faster, get alignment, build culture. There were all these great dimensions. And I would argue that world is also transforming again. But Julian, I would love for you maybe to, one, introduce yourself, but two, talk about your journey. Because when you and I met was like the early 2000s. Prescient was doing you and Toby were doing some really cool stuff. And you're getting into some major organizations that, became some of our customers as well at Igloo. But then you went on and, you actually became an individual contributor in some organizations. And you ultimately, continued to boil that sort of thought process and take yourself in a direction that I think is really timely right now in understanding the intersection of AI and how do we actually make it effective for people, and more importantly, how do we help people consume it and deal with it, because the rate of change has never been faster. That's a big question for you, but maybe start about the beginning when you and I first met, and yeah, it'd be great to tell the story and how you evolved your thinking as you went along the way.
Oh yeah, for sure. And also it's a real pleasure to join you here, Daniel. Like I'm a big fan of this series, and I will say I don't know how many people know what you do outside of the business, but your support for the Chamber of Commerce where you are, and the capacity you're building for startups in your region as the incubator is just tremendous indication of how you're committed to building community value as well. So it really, I'm genuinely honored and flattered to be joining you on the call today.
Thanks.
Yeah. And, one of the key things, I know this is sort of on your mind, it's come up with some other folks, that 70% of digital transformations fail. And there's no question that the number one reason for that is lack of leadership engagement. So there's a great quote from Harvard Business Review that says the most important factor in a digital transformation is not technology, but leadership. Leadership sets the vision, creates the climate for innovation, and builds the capabilities to execute. So I've been very fortunate to have delivered some big transformational work, and we had outstanding supportive leadership there. So I've experienced that as well, and sort of really looking forward today to talking about some of the leadership attributes we need to have when we're leading transformation. So to kick things off, my journey started, like everybody's in first year university. But my summer job, I was in the Canadian Naval Reserve and I was an officer cadet. So we were given very formal leadership training. And during university, I had a couple other jobs. So after the Navy, I ended up working on the manufacturing floor for a small manufacturer in Saskatoon. And, shock of shocks for a university student, I worked as a waiter. And then towards the end of my time at the University of Saskatchewan, my friends started a literary supplement to the university newspaper, and they're going to let us do it if we could make it cost neutral. So he was a really good writer. He had some good ideas about what to do, and then I helped him by raising ads, and I just got interested in the business model. So to pick up, was working with a friend to help get the literary supplement started, and was really interested in sort of the business model of publishing. And since then, so coming out of university, there was a couple things that I had. So one was it was really important to learn to take personal responsibility for your own compensation. I mean, that's essentially what a waiter does. You exist as part of a team, but you're kind of the visible value delivery system, as it were. And if you don't do a good job, nobody does well. So you have to understand your role, but you could also get instant feedback on how good a job you did. If there's a tip on the table, good. If not, bad. So you would learn how to correct your performance in real time. The Navy developed some really interesting questions about leadership. I can articulate that now, but obviously at the time we were really drilled in hierarchies and positional authority. Like that's what the military was all about. What you'd start to learn though is that there are people wearing a uniform and people who are leaders. And so that lesson has really stayed with me. And the manufacturing was absolutely fascinating because you learned how to turn components into a finished product through a system. And so you had, I had, as the university student, had one of the lowest of the low jobs, but it was really interesting to watch how something would come together. So that was also really interesting. And so after university, I did have kind of a checkered past. So I ended up being a magazine editor for a printed magazine about the printing industry. And I've said to Daniel, like that job ended, and it wasn't because I was bad at it. I won national magazine awards. I could go to trade shows in Germany and be a minor celebrity. It's just now I left before the role ended, but I could sort of see the writing on the wall and moved there to become a product manager for a company called AGFA. It was the world's largest pre-press manufacturer at the time. And so I joined to become a product manager for what was called a digital printing system, which was a very disruptive technology across the board. So it was a really interesting kind of entry point into the corporate world. I got promoted and became director of marketing. And a big part of that was unfortunately being on a senior leadership team that had to deal with the impact of digital transformation and essentially have to downsize quite dramatically while understanding how to maintain kind of our brand in the market and our core functions. And then went to Prescient, which Daniel mentioned, with a boutique agency where I was vice president of client development. So working mostly with Fortune 500s on social media and portals. And then went to BMO and CPPIB to lead teams in financial services. So as I say, a bit of a checkered career, but a couple threads that kind of combines that. So the magazine was unbelievable because what that did is it gave me access to leaders who were kind of the first leaders in history to deal with the kind of digital transformation they were facing. But also you'd start to learn frameworks from them, like my job was to go find the leaders, go find the people who are thinking hard about it because they made better articles, obviously. So really talk to the people who are thinking hard about it and hopefully getting it right. The other thing that I learned, and again, I came to this late. At the time, I couldn't have told you this in my 20s, but it's something Roger Martin calls integrative thinking, which is the ability to resolve tensions between opposing either or choices by creating a superior third way model. And what I took from that is integrative thinking is you have to integrate different knowledge disciplines. So at the magazine, we had a sales columnist, a marketing columnist, production people. You could just learn a lot about strategy. It was an amazing platform for learning about business, especially for an industry that was getting radically transformed. Another one that's really interesting, and we'll probably talk about this quite a bit, Daniel, is what's called the enablement layer, which is people, process, and technology. And the interesting thing with printing is a lot of printers had become very immersed in the enablement layer because it was printing and the technology hadn't changed since Gutenberg. So it was a centuries old business model with centuries old technology. And kind of what they'd lost sight of what were they enabling with print. Like print was about communications, it was about marketing, it was about information sharing, etc. But they'd become very associated with that enablement layer. And that's been a huge lesson for me. Like you have to know the enablement layer, but you have to know what the enablement layer is enabling. And that's almost as interesting. And then the final thing that's been very helpful for me, and this came from the magazine, is you have to be very good at finding unusual data or information sources and then articulating it memorably so people can take action. So that's kind of a quick overview on the
maybe you can come, because one of the things that always amazed me when you were at Prescient was your ability to punch above your weight class, and the clients that you guys would bring down was amazing. And was that just domain expertise and there were no leaders, or was it the outcomes that you were getting with the customers that you developed, the word of mouth sort of after effect?
It's a great question, and I think again it's an example of the integrative thinking. So one of the things that happened was, Toby was one of the first business leaders in the world to start a business blog, and so I joined just as he'd started the blog, and I remember thinking like, that's cute. I used to have $1 million budget to run ads and go to trade shows. But he was so cutting edge. But we were suddenly getting calls from like Sony, Bank of America, people like that, like major brands. It was a fairly new world to me, but what wasn't new was putting an integrated B2B demand generation funnel in place. And then also what really helped me was when I was at AGFA, because we recognized we had to transition kind of a transactional sales force to a solution-based system. I'd been trained in solution sales, and obviously professional services is an ultimate solution sales. So we put some discipline together there. And then I don't know if you ever met Carm Porco. Carm, after Prescient, ended up at Accenture, and he's recently retired.
Oh,
Carm,
I do. Yeah, I do remember Carm actually. Yeah.
yeah, so Carm was an amazing process guy. And so he designed this incredible process for analyzing an intranet, coming up with recommendations that was very repeatable. So again, coming out of industrial marketing, I could pick up on that. So we sort of put together, brand awareness with Toby's blog, very disciplined sales cycle, which was based on one very disciplined category definition, like what problem, like we didn't treat the intranet as an intranet or a design problem. So one of my jokes was Toby said that the job of an intranet is not to be cool. And so I would come into meetings and say, it's not to be cool. And I'm representing that. And as you can see, I'm overachieving on the objective of not being cool. like we need to talk to you about what's the intranet doing for you as a business utility. And then what was actually huge was, and then I think, as you know, in B2B sales, whoever wins the first sales call by setting the right criteria tends to win 70% of the deals. So that was the solution selling piece. We had kind of a unique business model in that we weren't designers, we weren't developers, we were a strategy shop. And so we had to, I'd have a business conversation with the SVP at company X to say, look, if you're going to do a SharePoint implementation and you're not smart enough to work with Igloo because it'll accelerate time to value, you're going to spend $3 to $5 million, right? So if you don't spend a couple $100,000 with us, you're going to spend $5 to $7 million, but you're probably only going to have a $3 million budget, so you're going to get stuck, right? So it was being able to articulate the value proposition of strategy. So that was a big part of it. And then a huge part of my work at AGFA had also been designing our go-to-market strategy and recognizing the importance of channel partners. And so we worked with a company called Inside Edge. They're part of Golan, which was a huge agency. And they had a couple guys who became really good friends of mine, but they were already immersed in a lot of those Fortune 500 companies. And they recognized that our service offering was very complementary because they didn't want to get into designing intranets. We didn't want to get into communication strategies, but they already had relationships with SVPs all over North America. So it was also part of our GTM with them and designing a value proposition to them, or even to folks like yourselves, right, at Igloo. Like we were conscious that we had to collaborate with other groups. And in your case, we added value by identifying leads, but also, quite frankly, getting the client cleaned up before you came in, so you didn't have to do as much work off the clock, right? So that was good for your bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that you demonstrated very successfully is you took your learnings from Prescient and the observations of working and building some of the most successful and maybe some of the projects that didn't go so well, but that's equally a valuable learning experience. And you sort of created this transformation playbook of best practices, right? And the things that you and I talked about previously was your ability to think about like the specific sequence on how you set that up. And I think it was something like design, culture, then technology. And you were also very emphatic about that order really mattered.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to drill into that. And is that sequence the same today?
Yeah, and it's even bigger today because I think the big thing that I was really talking about there, design matters, but also organizational design matters, right? So you have to know, and also, sorry, the integrative thinking becomes a big factor as well, right? So how do you bring different disciplines together? And so if you sort of start with why does organizational design start, what really good enterprise sales reps are good at understanding is who are all the players in an organization that are going to be impacted. And, one of the lines I was taught early on, it was actually a former IBM executive who did a workshop for us, but he said, you have to understand the impact of your product or service on the career of the person who's buying it. And it was just such a good insight, because you can't go in and assume that everything you're doing is a net positive to everybody, right? So you may be introducing risk, you may be taking capability away. So good enterprise salespeople are good at understanding that, but also not being manipulative with that information, but understanding who needs to be on board, right? So that organizational design becomes absolutely critical. It's also important because there's a lot of, and I see this a lot of client side. So what was interesting is that was a benefit I had when I went client side at BMO in particular, because I'd sort of had that training in enterprise design. And you had to very quickly understand that the people who are supposed to be helping you have their own financial incentives.
Yes.
And they may not be there to help you, right? And it's actually, now that I think about it, like, because it's, yeah, so the organizational design is really critical. So you actually have to understand what it looks like, understand how people are set up, and then understand how they're going to work with you. Just do that analysis. So that's where the organizational design becomes so key. And then the next thing is culture, right? So that's why it's organizational, then culture. Because if you've got a team that has a culture of collaboration, a culture of working with others to increase net value, they're just more likely to do a better job with the work they're doing. And it's not an either or. So what's interesting, if you look at this is kind of am I talking to a CEO or am I talking to an executive, right? So obviously, if it's the CEO, they have a lot of opportunity to structure their org in a certain way. They set the culture, so they can do a lot of that work. It's the case that a lot of executives, though, aren't in the perfect world. So how do they sort of get a read on where they are, and how do you get a read on the culture, have the right kind of culture to create collaboration? Because if you get moving, then the technology is always going to be hard and expensive. But if you've figured out how to work within those two big block diagrams before you start on the technology, it's less hard and less expensive, if that's making sense.
Yeah, so I think one of the things you talked about when you and I talked about before was like, how do you break those silos to get everyone working? Because some of those silos are the people who are actually trying to sink you, right? They're not trying to make you successful. And is that something that, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink? Or like, what were your strategies to do that?
Yeah, and so one of the things is, I'd say it sort of starts with personal motivation, because it's sometimes interesting to think, like, because I just really believe strongly in silos or getting silos down. And you sort of think, like, when did you have that feeling? And so, funnily enough, it started for me in the Navy. So I was 18. We had to get on a ship and sail down to Bermuda to escort the tall ships up to the gas base. So it was pretty serious work. It was also during the Cold War, and the Canadian military at the time was not well resourced to kind of do its mission. It's changed a lot since then. So what I'm describing is not what people today should anticipate. One of the things that happened is we did an attack exercise on the way down to Bermuda, where we pretended to attack one of our submarines. And so I was talking to one of the officers on the bridge of the boat, and I'm like, our sonars are only good to 12 miles, right? Like, how are we going to detect a submarine? He's like, that's not our biggest problem. The biggest problem is the ships tracking us have got nuclear tipped missiles that work from 25 miles out. So we won't even know they're going to hit us, right?
Yeah.
Then the other thing is, before we went to sea, there's a maritime division, which is the people who go to sea, and a logistics division who support them. And when the maritime people go to sea, they have to take stuff like lifeboats and life jackets and things like that. And it annoyed the logistics people like crazy. Like, it took us forever to get on a boat. Like, we'd have to line up, we'd have to give our social insurance number, we'd have to sign that we'd taken certain pieces of gear, and then we get lectured by the logistics organization. So because they'd got everything tickety-boo in their warehouse and we'd wrecked it. And so one of our family friends was a management consultant. So when I came back after the first summer, I'm like, what's the deal? Like the Navy exists to put boats on water, people on boats. That's what we're there to do. And he said, well, you've told me the story about the nuclear tip mission. Like, what happens in an organization is when the organizational objectives are hard to attain or difficult to attain, the logistics function can take over. So I'll always remember that. So it was kind of a classic silo-driven thing where the logistics people were in their silo and they didn't even feel connected to the Navy's mission. right? And it was such a clear mission to me. I'm like, that's unfathomable to me. Like, it just makes no sense. And then when I went to Print Action, the magazine was struggling a bit when I went there. And there's often a lot of friction in magazines between editorial, sales, and production. And it happened, it was a small company. So those other departments were mostly guys my own age. And we're all kind of wanted to show what we can do. And we got along really well. Like we would, it was tough. Like we'd get angry with each other, but we delivered, and we collectively turned it from not that well regarded to one of the premier magazines in the world. So the experience was just fantastic. So again, it goes back to, we didn't get stuck in our silos. We didn't point fingers at each other. It's obviously easier when it's a smaller company, but it was just, the feeling was great. Like when I was a teenager, we were the provincial soccer champions for 3 years in a row. And like, winning as a team is the best feeling you can have. And I'm like, this is amazing. And then you enter the corporate world, and you're like, that's where you start to realize about, wrong financial incentives and stuff like that. And, people can look at the McKinsey reports that show that, people who break down silos, they, double their revenue, they increase their customer sat. Like, it's all really clear that happens, but then people are people, and they get caught up in their financial incentives. So long-winded story, like I think this, but the key thing there is why I do believe it starts with leadership, because one thing is the leader should intend to work outside of silos. Like, I think that's really important, and it's in the leader's self-interest to do so. If you've joined a large organization, they've aggregated a lot of resources for you, and if you know how to activate them in a very focused way, like, nothing can beat you. So I think that's where a lot of it starts with the leader. And don't wait for your CEO. If the CEO's is busy with some other stuff and you need to collaborate, do it. And then the other thing is this idea of integrated knowledge, especially the enterprise sales. So how do you sort of understand who you need to work with? What are some of the, what are they working with? There is a bit of a playbook you can go through. I'm just conscious I had a bit of a long answer on that one, but can unpack the playbook if that's helpful.
Well, I mean, I think the playbook's great, but I mean, I think, just given our time constraint, it would be great maybe to sort of talk about the playbook, but also, you've been through organizations like print that have been heavily disrupted. Then magazines have been heavily disrupted. So you've seen how technology, like, and different waves of it, have impacted whole industries. And, now we're about to see macro impacts across different dimensions because of AI. And I know you've been a huge sort of follower and lifelong learner related to change management, but you've also been pretty ahead of the curve related to MIT's AI course that you took. And I would argue, since you took that course, there's been dramatic change within that industry, because I'm guessing some of the learnings don't necessarily apply anymore. But yeah, I'd love your perspective on playbook, the constant rate of change, and what's currently happening. And are some of those threads and patterns from the playbook persisting, or have any of them changed?
That's a great question. So I'll maybe start with what I've seen across the organizations, because they're, like, obviously media, finance, and technology, vastly different. I think what gets interesting, though, and I think what I would say isn't changing, is what the leadership competency has to be. And so if you look at sort of some variables there, what you're working with is capacities, constraints, and drivers, right? So if you look at what was the driver of change in the media industry, a lot of it was the internet, right? So when the internet came along, it for newspapers, for example, had a competitor for the first time. And so that was a business driver to do something transformational. Unfortunately, what they didn't fully understand, I mean, those of us in the media world know this. So when a classified ad produced about 60% of the revenues, but 90% of the profits for a newspaper, and Craigslist took all that away, right? So, and newsrooms are really expensive. So all of a sudden you had a media organization that had a non-negotiable driver, and most of their economic capacity was taken away. And it's been very, very hard for them to respond. When you get into financial services and tech, also very different, but very different in terms of their respective, capacities, constraints, and drivers, right? So in one of the things that gets very interesting, this is why leadership becomes so critical, is you look at what kind of leadership capacity are those organizations developing. So in my experience, the financial services companies do a great job of training leaders. Like I did an advanced leadership program through Rotman when I was at BMO, had very, very good trainers come in at CPPIB. Like we get a lot of very, very good leadership training. And I want to be careful when I say this because it's not meant to be controversial, but financial organizations have to have a very high risk awareness, right? Because if you say what's the worst thing that can happen, it can be pretty bad. Like anti-money laundering is very bad. Mortgage fraud is very bad, right? And so a lot of the leadership was about being good at creating certainty for your team. And it wasn't dissimilar to the Navy in some respects, right? Because there is certainty about the Navy's mission. Like we're supposed to get on a boat and potentially go attack other people, right? So, and success and failure was really clear in that world. But so a lot of the leadership is about keeping people focused, keeping them moving, keeping them pushing against stuff. But they don't necessarily have the capacity for innovation, the capacity for finding new ways of doing things. So that becomes an interesting adjustment that you have to make. And then technology, what I'm finding is to a certain extent they have almost infinite drivers and infinite capacity because they can always give themselves more capacity. You know what I mean? Like they own the tech. What ends up happening is they almost need to have some business constraints put around them. Like, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to achieve? So two very different leadership challenges. Like I find when I'm coaching, I did a workshop in Frankfurt last year mostly with leaders of CMS firms and digital agencies. And very few of them had any training at all in leadership, right? So a lot of the stuff I was able to share was kind of out of courses that I've had. Whereas when you talk to folks who are in the more sort of traditional world, a lot of it is about, using design thinking to unlock new ways of thinking or creating psychological safety for your team so that they're going to be prepared to take on new challenges. So, and to come back to the bigger question about how fast things are changing, like I did the MIT course in AI about a year ago, and 2 years before that, I did the certificate in digital transformation with MIT as well. And so much has changed in those 2 to 3 years. What's really interesting, though, is they do a very good job of rooting everything in leadership competencies and business strategies, right? So the AI thing is all based on Porter's 3 sources of value around differentiation, cost efficiency, or focus. And then how do you deploy AI to achieve that, right? So the specific tools of AI are going to change very dramatically. But if you, as a leader, know how to associate the work that you're doing to those 3 sources of business value and make decisions, then it gets easier, right? And then the really big thing with the digital transformation program was very systematically understanding financial incentives within your organization, like where are people set up. Like, so what the case study we used actually was Kodak. So it worked great for me because I was at AGFA and Kodak were huge competitors, and so I'd seen all those things happen where incumbent groups have put processes in place that are really working, and they don't want somebody to come in and mess with it. So a lot of it again came down to leadership competencies to understand how do you do that analysis. If you are doing transformation, like who's going to win, but also who's going to lose, because somebody will lose, or even worse, they're going to win, but they're going to think they lose. And then how do you have some techniques around enterprise sales to do that stakeholder map, go find them, go work with them?
So I noticed that pattern seems to weave into your stakeholder and helping the people understand the value. I mean, that's a constant. Back to your playbook, did anything change? And are there any new chapters or patterns to it?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is one thing. I'll start with what hasn't changed. And so, but I think this is a big area for leaders to really work on, is to really work around the communications piece of what's going on, right? And there's 2 components there. So one is leaders have to become good at telling stories, right? So very specifically with transformation, I mean, transformation is, a lot of people are moving away from it. I know, Jesse was talking about commercial value. We're hearing a lot of people, commercial excellence. A lot of people are talking about operational effectiveness. The problem is that's not dramatic. So, because I remember talking to a CMO at Liberty Mutual when we were doing a project for them back in the day, and I said, an intranet is a process, not an event. He says, but the problem is nobody's motivated by process, right? They love events. So you have to have a bit of an event. And so, but so part of that is transformation is fundamentally about making change. And so change should have a beginning and an end, right? And stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So leaders have to be able to tell the story of transformation. Why are we doing it? How's it going to feel when we're on the journey? How's it going to feel when it's over? That kind of stuff. And that's becoming a big part of it. One of the quotes I love, it's from a writer called Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And what he said is, if you want to build a ship, do not drum up the men to gather wood, divide work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the sea. So I think that is kind of an old. He wrote that years ago, but I think that's still a critical component of leadership, and it's almost become more important. What I would say,
but that's more, just to be clear, that's more a sense of a mission approach or a vision approach, right? Just like
it is,
as opposed to a task.
It is, but it's so important because transformation is a cognitive challenge, right? It's bridging, it's a mindset. It's how do we go from point A to point B, and you have to. That story and that vision is mission critical. Like that's what HBR was talking about is leaders have to be able to give people a sense for what they're trying to accomplish. The task one is I'm finding very interesting because it's starting to get easy for everybody to do everything, right? Because I mean, even with vibe coding, you can go in and you can be a developer, right? So I think it's I think what leaders have to get very good at, and they emphasize this in the MIT course, is process analysis, like understanding how does the work get done, what are the steps that you're going through, and then do the basics of process design, right? Like you design a process to prevent a defect. So what defect are you trying to, start with that? Where is it coming? And a lot of the assignment that I did at MIT was very much around, the area that I focused on was around, customer effectiveness. Like how can we get closer to the customer?
That's a really interesting point I'd love for you to unpack. Yep. And maybe just because if you look at a lot of the current developments in AI compute or AI working or a vibe coding approach or the way even development is now done, yep, or even the way robotics is now beginning to assess, is they're looking out the output and reverse engineering the process or the desired state and going backwards. What do you do in that world when it's like that's totally opposite to what you're talking about? But how do you make sure you're doing it properly, and how do you put that on top? Do you reflect after the point in time? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Sorry, that's a really interesting question. So, I mean, for me, what I've found is what you don't want to do is accept that if a company has a process, it's the right process, right? Because that's sometimes the risk is they have a process and then they want to figure out how to automate the process. So, and I think I keep coming back to this idea of leadership competencies. Like the most important thing is curiosity, right, and imagination, and not just because when you mention what I'm finding is when you ask simple questions, they can get very frustrated, right? Because they're like, this is a waste of time. We need to get going. We've been doing this for years. Like, what are we doing here? But it's, the risk with the AI is you may not have a good process, but it's so good. It's just, it's gonna output more errors than if the goal of a process is to prevent defects, but you've got a process that produces defects, AI is going to produce defects faster, right? Mm-hmm. So that's part of that is really asking yourself how you're going to come at it differently. And this is just a personal thing. Like I go back to the enablement layer, and the enablement layer is about what it's enabling, not the enablement layer itself. And I think too many people get excited by the enablement layer. And it's you really start by saying, what are we trying to do? And then quite frankly, how do we ladder that up to one of Porter's 3 business values? And is that what we're doing? And it's surprising not everybody's comfortable doing that. Sorry, I know that's a bit of a wishy-washy answer.
No, it's good. I mean, the whole goal is to get people thinking. I mean, and I know you've been thinking a lot about this. So, in some areas, organizations are moving real fast, maybe too fast. And where do you feel like, based on, your sort of assessment and also working with a bunch of organizations doing this, where people are potentially opening themselves up to huge waste or risk? And at the same time, where do you believe organizations may be falling behind or moving too slowly? And can those things
Yeah.
happen in the same organization, or are they different? They're symptoms of different organizations.
No, it's such a good question. I mean, I think it varies sort of organization to organization. This is going to sound like one of those really generic answers, but it's amazing how many people don't do it. So especially if the CEO is saying, let's get this project started, let's get fast, let's get moving. This is the leadership, the CEO's responsibility now to understand how good is the enablement layer. Like that enablement layer, people, process, and technology, and especially data, right? Because if that's not in good shape, I'm sure you're coming across this. That's the wall. That's the first wall that they hit, right? Mm-hmm. And this is why I say culture is so important, because hypothetically, say you have tech debt, nobody wants to tell the CEO about the tech debt, right? Because they may not have created it, but they may be responsible for cleaning it up. But you talk to most people implementing AI, tech debt is their biggest barrier. And so part of it is building a culture of honesty, of radical candor, where the CEO is able to talk to some people and say, how is our enablement layer tech ready? Now, I'm not an expert in mortgage processes and things like that. Like, I'm sure people are really drilling into that. But to come back to your intranet question, I'm finding that one fascinating, because we're actually getting IT saying, oh, we'll just put an agent on top and people can find the content. And that's guaranteed to fail, because the enablement layer is so bad, right? Because nobody's cleaned up their content. A lot of the stuff that's actually mission critical isn't there. And so the agent is going to start to work with a very limited data set. And this is where AI actually becomes a very big risk, right? Because I'm sure you remember back in the age of enterprise search, like everybody's like, let's skip our intranet because we're going to fix intranet search, and we're going to have Google appliance for the organization, and we'll find everything we're looking for. And then search still sucked, right? But the danger is that if you get a bad search result, it's irritating. Mm-hmm. If an agent hallucinates and tells you wrong information, it's a major business problem, right? Because you may have a customer-facing employee communicate a mortgage rate to a client that's wrong, and you end up with a class action lawsuit if that happens enough times, right? So that's where you actually have to get in and do the work. And I think why I'm stressing that is I think I really took this from the MIT course, is to be successful with AI, you have to have people prepared to do the non-sexy work, right? And you can't get around that. So if you want to go fast, you actually have to understand where you can go fast. Part of the question is like, where is the risk if you go too fast? I'd say moving ahead without getting a clear, honest picture of your enablement layer. Obviously, any work, especially if a competitor's doing it, that's improving customer experience or employee experience, and you're falling behind, I mean, that's a flywheel, right? As you know. So once the company's on the leading edge of that flywheel, like every year or every quarter, they get better. And the people who are behind, every quarter they fall further behind, and they'll never catch up, right? Because it's cyclical. So that's where you do have to actually look for some of those leverage points and what's non-negotiable around EX and CX. But again, and then what I would say too, this is why I keep stressing the leadership thing. You have to have leaders who model radical candor. Like, tell me what I'm really seeing, because AI will surface your dysfunction if you're not careful. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to you, or?
Yeah. For sure. I mean, I think I would argue like the agents are going to get pretty smart and be able to identify some stuff quickly and say this is old or this is new. But the hallucination or the aggregation and context, the big challenge with AI is auditability still, right? So show me how you derived that, how you got to that. And like, I mean, that's one of the cool things about Claude, for example. You can develop plugins that actually will validate the sources. But the fact that you have to go back on check on anything and even the sources that were referenced, it just shows the inherent risk to an organization unless they're trying to solve for it. But you didn't answer the question about, where do you believe organizations may be going too slow? Love to get that thought from you.
I mean, so personally, I think they're going way too slow on the employee experience piece, because there's just so much low-hanging fruit there, and employees are such a vital part of how you're doing this. Like you need to be able to communicate effectively with them. it goes back to your question about the intranet. Like, it's a transformation layer. Like, if the information is easy to find, you're clear and consistent about what you're doing. And the big thing is that is a communications layer that crosses all the silos. So it's the one utility that gets everybody out of their day-to-day work and work as one company. So I think that's really critical. And there's just some obvious ways that AI can help, right? So one of the stats that's showing, if you talk to employees, I think 87% of employees say their employer does a bad job of communicating to them. Their employer does a bad job of communicating to them. And then if you look at how employers are responding, they're sending more and more emails, and they're cognitively overwhelming their employees, right? And so I think there's some obvious quick wins there around AI, where you could easily get a sense of, you could build in some AI tools into your CMS, for example, to say, hey, you've reached the limit of how many messages you need to send out right now. Like, we could tell you, we've got some predictive analytics that you're going to overwhelm your people. Or, based on some heat mapping that we've done on pages, like, everybody stops reading after this many words, and you've exceeded those, and you've left the good stuff at the end, right? So there's very good information about that. I think, as I say, if you're going through major disruption that is going to have a big impact on people's lives, I think using AI there is a really interesting opportunity to check if you're running a balanced scorecard, you're going to check all 4 quadrants on your balanced scorecard if you use AI to improve communications to your employees.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, now, I know you've worked with, in Canada, a couple of the largest financial institutions, and you've really developed some great expertise. You decided to go out on your own and, and helping organizations deal with a lot of these transformation issues.
Yeah.
What would you say is, in the organizations that you're finding, what is that big blind spot? That organization, is it the communications that they think they're doing a better job than they actually are, or is it something else?
I mean, honestly, I think it's leadership development. So it's either organizations that have leadership development, but it's based on a leadership style that's very much based on motivating teams to solve unambiguous problems, and not understanding that once you're leading a cognitively diverse team, how do you do that? So you have to have very different ways of thinking about it. And then, as I mentioned, even in some of the really innovative companies that are out there that I'm talking to in software or CMS, like, I've spent some time with CEOs there who've literally had no leadership training, right? Because they're just really good at what they did. And so they grew their business, they solved problems for their clients, they grew staff, but they didn't have to stop and reflect on some of this stuff. So, I think the big opportunity there is, there are people doing very comprehensive work to help scale leadership competencies. Like, Jesse's doing phenomenal work there. I think there's a really interesting opportunity to target the individual leader, and just help draw out some of the stuff they already know, because most people are instinctively good at what they do. So help them there. So the 2 areas I find is absolutely the communications piece, but not writing an email. It's knowing how to tell a story, right? And then the second thing is really, I find this with coaching clients, it's hard for them to figure out that the people they need to lead are not like them, right? Mm-hmm. and so helping them out. And a phrase that I find both groups really benefit from is a definition of leadership I was taught was, it's the ability to get things done through others. And so that's where there's some specific tweaks to leadership accountability you have to do. So one is defining the thing. Like, what is it? How are we scoping it? What's the problem? What problem are we solving? What resources do we need to have? Who needs to collaborate with us to support us in achieving that? So there's some very tangible work you can do there. And then the other big piece is the others. Like, I'll just say, I've been quite shocked at the number of leaders that I've met who don't think that hiring talent is their job, right? Like, that's what HR does. And once you're a leader and you have to get things done through others, the most important thing you have is the others. And I was blessed throughout my people management career to have amazing mentors. And they just really drilled into you that you have to be directly involved in the talent on your team. And mm-hmm. The final thing I like to say to folks like that is talent's like water. Like, it has to flow to be healthy. And what you don't want is it to stop flowing and stagnate on your team, right? Mm-hmm. Then you just can't get as much done. But you
Yeah.
have to accept that the talent's going to flow off your team to stay healthy, which means you have to become a talent magnet. And there's some specific things you can do around that so that people are drawn to your team, and you have to have a talent pipeline. And what I've been able to find is that sort of drives team renewal, because every time a good person leaves and you hire another good person, you change your capacity. And you have to know how to manage that renewal cycle very
Are
well.
you speaking from experience? Because one of the questions I wanted to ask was,
Mhm.
what was the biggest leadership mistake you made in these programs or transformations, and how did you change to operate it, to fix it?
Well, so generally speaking, I mean, this is a truism, but every manager you talk to at the end of their career said they were too fast to hire and too slow to fire, right? And so I have had to let people go. And that sounds like a negative thing. In most cases, it was a fit to role problem. Like the organization had changed, and the role that person had changed, and it was no longer, they weren't contributing and they weren't satisfied in it. So
Mhm.
for sure that's been a truism, and it's, once you've been through it as a more experienced manager, you take it really seriously, and so performance management in a nice way becomes a critical component. What I'll tell you is the biggest mistake I made was, I'm just trying to think if I tell it. I don't think I'm giving away any state secrets here. So when I joined BMO, we had joined right after making a major acquisition in the United States, and so like literally that work was way in progress, and so my team had to develop a new portal for the US business, but it was actually, it's a kind of a classic integration thing. So we had to bring a newly acquired company onto a platform, and also bring over the existing companies, so that everybody would feel like they're one company, right? The homepage portal was an area I had a lot of background in, so I was able to sort of just push that through, and I didn't necessarily, I was literally months into the job, but I just left prescient, and this is what I did for a living, right? So I was able to bang that one through. There was a very specific knowledge management utility that one of the teams was using, and it was a homegrown solution. It didn't really make a lot of sense to me. So I hired a really well-known outside agency and embedded them with the team to basically work with them to design a solution. It didn't really make sense to me, but I was like, okay, as long as it works for them, like they're part of the solution design, it's going to be fine. And so we brought it over, and then there's a whole bunch of leadership changes within that group, and some of the same people who'd helped design it said it didn't work, right? In which was just a mystery to me. And so what we ended up doing is going to that group's team, and they assigned a PMO and a change management expert, and we went through quite a while to sort of bring everybody on board. We didn't necessarily have to change the solution, but we hadn't understood some of the back end training that was required, like kind of a classic issue there. And so I was just like, oh, that was what I realized, is I had unintentionally imposed change to a work process, and I'd fallen afoul of the organizational design, because I worked for head office, and so we were an umbrella team that supported 6 different business units, but there's not the same relationship between the head office function or the corporate function and the business unit function. And so it appeared that I was imposing something on them, right? And so there was a psychological pushback on that. It was all, in retrospect, very rational behavior that I should have recognized. So going forward, what I learned to do, because we replatformed 800 intranet sites and all 6 portals, the first thing I did is I'd go to the chief operating officer for the business unit and say, do you want to make this a transformational project, right? Because it is a chance to have visible change. If there's something you want to associate with that, it's all good. But it goes back to what I'm saying. You have to understand who you have to work with and what resources do they have. And project managers and change managers were a scarce resource for the COO, right? And they had a lot of change portfolios they were supporting. And so all but one of them said, not really, right? Like, it's not because they're being irresponsible. It's just like, my docket is already really full. And I'm like, well, I'm on a timeline because we're on end of life technology. So we're going to recategorize this. It's not transformational. Like, we're going to make sure we don't change the UI, and then my team will do all the work in the back end to bring it into the new code base and everything else. So if you see what I'm saying, like, that was a big lesson for me, is just not falling afoul of the organizational dynamics and understanding some of the basics of change management. And it goes back to my earlier point about get the org design right first, get the culture right, but also be respectful of don't unintentionally throw change at a colleague if the colleague doesn't know it's coming and doesn't welcome it.
We're getting to the end of our conversation, but I'd like to hammer out a couple more questions at minimum. So you and I started off knowing intranets. Are they a thing of the past now with AI? Are they still relevant? Is it an employee resource center, or like, what do you think about that?
So it's interesting. So I would say 100% it's needed. I think the number one problem is very few people have seen a good intranet. And so they're always trying to leave behind the intranet because there's always something wrong with it. So again, if you go back to what it's enabling, one of the things I like to say, especially in the digital era, is the intranet's like the lobby of your building, right? And so when you need to have a culture of collaboration, get people out of their silos, what happens when you go to an office building, right? Like when I was at BMO, a bunch of us went to First Canadian Place, right? It has a beautiful lobby that you walk through. And so when you walk through the lobby, like right away, you're entering a defined workplace because there's branding and everything that tells you you're there. You also know what's happening in the company because you can have some signage up that talks about things that are happening. And then you also know how to go find what you need because you can get on the elevator. And if you're going to look for HR, they're on the 26th floor. So you go up to the 26th floor and you look for them. And increasingly there's a concierge. And if you're not sure where to go, you ask the concierge and the concierge can help information for you, right? But if you see what I'm saying, it's the theater of that experience of passing through the lobby. And then the other issue that happens is you go through it quite quickly, right? Like you don't linger. Because if everybody who was working there spent 20 minutes in the lobby before they went to work, it would be a bit of a gong show. And then the other key thing, though, is it's that opportunity for the organization to provide an experience to the employees before they go sit at their desk, right? So I think that's one of the things I really look at today is, for people in the Microsoft environment, you go right to work, whether you're on the bus or you're sitting at home, because you go into your Outlook inbox and you go into your Teams. And so you enter the productivity layer right away, and you're missing the employee engagement layer. So to come back to the intranet, I think if you have a healthy intranet that's functioning as a place that people pass through on their way to start the job, but as much as possible, 100% of the organization pass through the same, to coin a phrase, portal on the way in. They know they work for the same company. They feel a sense of engagement with the company, and they have a general sense that they're all working towards the same purpose. So if you define an intranet that way, I think it's mission critical.
Mm-hmm. And so we're always trying to pay it forward. So, is there one book that you like? You mentioned mentors are really important, and I know you're very learned and you read a lot. From a transformation perspective, what would be the one book you would say you should read or listen to?
Yeah, so I'm going to come at this in a bit of an odd way. So for a couple of years, I've been in a science fiction book club, and so with a bunch of guys who grew up reading sci-fi, and like one guy he has his PhD in philosophy, and he's a leading philosopher on AI. The other guy has a PhD in quantum physics. The other guy has a PhD from Yale in economics, and the other guy's a senior analyst at Gartner, right? So super well-educated guys who all grew up reading tons of sci-fi, and I didn't read sci-fi. I'm just finding that to be amazing as we work with AI, because so many of the scientific founders were reading sci-fi. And so a book I really like, it's called Ancillary Justice. It won the Hugo Prize a while back. And it's the protagonist was a ship's artificial intelligence, and it's been cut off. And so it's interesting to read how machine learning functions when it doesn't have LLMs. And I think one of the reasons I'm saying that is so much about what we're trying to do with AI is about imagination and expanding yourself to, or exposing yourself to other things. Like, I think it's picking up on a question from earlier. Like, one of the things that blew my mind at MIT is we did a case study on a factory that is entirely AI driven and robotic. And it goes back to the process design. So the thing that they've done now is if you have to pick and pack, they don't put socks with socks. They just put socks all over the factory, but they're with an RFID tag, they remember where it is. And then the robots move horizontally and vertically. So their courses are plotted by AI, so they never collide, right? So they're the efficiency of that warehouse goes beyond anything we've seen before. And it's because they designed for machine learning and AI, they didn't replicate a process. And so I don't run warehouses, but just that nugget has got me rethinking everything we do. To come back to it. And that's why I just believe that that stimulating your imagination is one of the, like, there's a bunch of hardcore stuff you can do. There's tons of great resources out there, but just to be provocative, I'd suggest reading an interesting sci-fi novel.
Very interesting. And then just to make it really practical, then, if you're talking to someone or one of your clients and you're saying, look, one action a week can have a huge impact, what should that be for a leader?
Well, so for CEOs, they need to look at their calendar, right? Because CEOs are notorious for doing what's in their calendar, and they don't always enter their own calendar, right? So the first thing a CEO should do is look in their calendar and see how much time they've put in to do two things. So one is to learn, and the other is to communicate. Because I've worked with some phenomenal leaders. There was a guy called Frank Teacher who was COO at BMO. He was a brilliant communicator, and I worked with the team that supported him. Frank literally put communicate in his calendar. It was more sophisticated than that, but he knew it was his job, and he helped the bank get through a lot of interesting, like very good times, but he could be counted on to communicate. And the other thing that's interesting is there's a big debate right now about whether CEOs should become tech savvy. So MIT is a big advocate of that they say you really have to learn. And then friends of mine in the tech space are saying, look, the CEO should let the technicians technish and leave us alone, right? Like we know this more than them. What I would say, especially for a CEO, is you got to do it for yourself. Don't let somebody else show it to you for two reasons. One, they're probably going to filter it to try to be helpful, but they're probably going to take some stuff out based on what they think you're going to be interested in. But the second thing is the CEO's job is to work, on the business, not in the business. But they need that imagination. Like, as you know, CEOs are super smart. And once they see something, nobody but them can figure out what to do with that information. And that's their job. So I would say that. And then I think for executives, the one thing they need to do is ask when's the last time they talked to their direct reports. Like, how are they feeling? How are they doing? I mean, the amount of change that people are going through right now is unprecedented in our lifetimes. And
Julie, on that note, sorry, I totally forgot to even go down this, because you wrote an article a couple of weeks ago or a month or so ago, just about how do you actually manage this new acceleration as a human,
right?
And the need to feel like, not the need, but the pressure to feel like you're always on now, and that is really hard to manage. Yeah, if you could maybe go deep on that a bit, that would be great. Because I mean, I think that's where I think you could add a lot of value to organizations, because you've really thought a lot about this.
Yeah. So again, the big thread here is, and this was my big unlock from MIT, right? So that transformation or deploying AI is a cognitive challenge, and you need a cognitively diverse team to do that, right? So the concept of that is very clear cut. Like, if you have, and you need it, they're solving ambiguous problems. Like, you don't necessarily know what the problem is, and you don't know what the solution is. So we had some great lectures at BMO, like including from a Harvard math prof who showed us how much better diverse teams were at problem solving than non-diverse teams, right? And so, especially because it's like the example I use is, if you come to a room full of accountants and give them a problem to solve, they'll frame it as an accounting problem and give you an accounting solution, right? But if you have a room with an accountant, a poet, an engineer, a salesperson, a marketing person, they're going to frame the problem very differently and give you a much more sophisticated solution. So you need that. But again, this is why I'm saying a lot of it comes down to the individual leader and how they're leading their team. And you have to start to respect the cognitive load of your team, right? And since I've wrote about that, I've heard a lot of people, like some people, like, so one of the things when you're a manager, you manage your time, you manage your money, you manage your emotions. Like, that's what I was taught. You now have to manage your cognitive budget and your team's cognitive budget. And so, friends have pointed out, for a lot of people today, by the time they arrive at work, their cognitive budget has been depleted, right? Like, because if you have to go to work, the subways are time consuming and can be challenging to be on, right? You got to worry about where your kids are. The news can be a bit scary. So they're already not arriving with 100%. We bombard people with so much information at work, like the cognitive overload is immense. And then, and then tasks have never been more difficult, like trying to figure it out. And then quite frankly, in economic times, people, if they have a job, they're very concerned to keep their job, right? So they're spending a lot of cognitive time on that. So as a leader, you just have to take responsibility for thinking empathetically for your team. Like, what are they going through? What are you asking them to do? And it's not just putting your arm around their shoulder, like very tangibly, how do you get into their workload? Like, what are they doing? Not without micromanaging them, if you see what I'm saying, but helping them find their sticking points. And maybe a quote that I love, I did a time management course years ago, and one of my colleagues was the national sales manager, and he was notorious for being like a month behind on all his emails, right? And so we started things off, and the guy was saying you have to figure out how to be organized. And he said, I'm so busy fighting fires, I don't have time to get organized. And the guy said, what do you think a firefighter does? And I'm like, oh, they know they're going to have to fight a fire.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I use that with my team, right? Like there's rules we have that are simple, like a 3-putt rule for email. Like, if you're going to send me an email 3 times on the same subject, come and see me, right? Because it's a terrible way to try. Like, it's obviously a complex problem, and we'll solve it faster with a conversation. And then the other thing is, like, once you fought the same fire 3 times, your job is to not let that fire start a second time or the 4th time, right? So why is it starting? It's why process becomes so important. And then the final thing is that, Brené Brown and Adam Grant are doing some great writing around the importance of psychological safety, right? And the phrase I like is the team has to own success and the leader owns failure. Like create a space where something not going right isn't catastrophic for them. And the final thing I will say as a leader, these days people like to talk about there's no such thing as failure, there's just data, right? So failing should be okay, but in a tense environment, it's not okay. At the same time, so you have to create a world in which somebody can fail but not have it be catastrophic to the business. Like, it does produce data. But the second thing I will say is it's an accountability thing, is your team has to know the difference between failure and a mistake, because you can still make mistakes, and mistakes are unforgivable, right? But failure is something that you're trying to learn, that kind of stuff. So that's actually, to come back to it, is once you're a leader of a team, you have to put time in your day to lead your team. Like, this can't be a side of the desk project. If you go back to your job is to get things done through others, you have to make sure the others are cognitively prepared to give you maximum capacity.
Awesome. So, Julian, this has been great. So, I mean, for those who want to go deeper, and how can they find you and how do they engage with you? Reach out on LinkedIn, and what would you prefer?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best way to go. And I mean, as I say, I used to say this at Prescient, like the first time a vice president would phone you and say, like, how do you work with us? I was like, look, I assume you're smart. Like, you didn't get to be a vice president at a Fortune 500 company and get your MBA by not being smart. You're probably just looking at something you've never done before or don't have the capacity to do. So I don't even start with the assumption in a conversation that I can help people, if you know what I mean. Like, it's sometimes a 5-minute conversation. They're like, oh, I get it, or that's a great quote, I can put it to work. And then some folks are like, maybe I can spend a bit more time with you. But I think the first thing is always happy to have a quick chat, see if there's a quick idea I can share, and folks can put it into action right away.
Awesome. And anything in closing, you mentioned a couple of your big mentors, but what's the one thing you constantly take home from someone who gave you some great advice? Close with that, maybe.
So I use this a lot. So I had an amazing mentor when I first started at AGFA. He'd been a sales manager at Xerox for 25 years. And back in the day, that was the only American company that had lost market share to a Japanese competitor and won it back. And they won it back by being a ruthless sales force. And I was a very creative guy. And so what John liked to say to me is, if you want to solve world hunger, pick a street. And so what I always took from that is there's always something you can do now, but don't make it so big that you can't start. Like, find the street that you're going to start on and get started. And I've extended that to even the transformation work, because once you pick a street, figure out who your neighbors are. Like, very quickly, that's going to tell you who you need to work with. But that's my favorite, is if you want to, like, there's so many world hunger level issues that we're dealing with, and each one of us has got go back to leadership's the ability to get things done through others. Every one of us is a leader because everybody's got access to AI. So our capacity for change is immense, but pick a street and get started.
And then finally, you and I have kids.
Yeah.
Like, what are you telling your kids in this current environment when they're starting out and establishing their careers?
Well, one is resilience. So the presentation that I gave in Frankfurt is called "Everybody's Good When It's Easy," and it's something I said to my daughter when she was 8 and she didn't want to go to dance class, right? Like I'm saying, sometimes life is showing up, right? And then what I'm really emphasizing to my daughter is networking. And she's at the University of Edinburgh doing a course in entrepreneurship and innovation. And, I've connected to her, a couple folks I know that she can talk to me they're so generous with their time and they've given her so many good ideas. And then one of the people I connected her to was this amazing young woman who'd been an intern when I was at CPPIB, and she's now with a really cool consulting company in New York. And Sherry's advice to my daughter was like, network with your peers, like get to know smart people and work with them, because I think in the era of AI, human relationships are going to be more important than ever, and sort of finding a cohort of people who want to get places and want to help each other is going to get you a long way. I mean, everybody's got to learn AI, that's mandatory, and you have to learn it to work with it, and there's tons of courses to take. But as long as you're, set your intention, and your intention should be to find people that you like spending time with, and do the basics of networking, like learn from them. And then also make sure you contribute to them. Like how can you help those folks? Don't just approach it as a one-way transactional conversation. How do you create net value between you all?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Well, great close. And as always, you add net value to me, Julian. So thank you very much.
Yeah. No, and as I say, I said at the start, Daniel, what you're achieving with the company is truly impressive. But, you and I reconnected when I was working with a company at Haltech, and I walked past your office, and you just put yourself out there to find, folks who need help, and you're very generous with your time that way.
Well, got to pay it forward. Helps. Yep. Anyways, well, thanks. It was awesome.